He stood alone in the courtroom, wrinkled coat, eyes like rain-soaked glass, while the bailiff sneered and the judge didn't even look up from his papers. "Just another bum," they whispered. But then his trembling fingers dialed a number. 5 minutes later, the doors burst open. A woman in heels sharp enough to cut glass walked in. And suddenly, the courtroom froze. No one knew who he really was. No one knew what he'd built. And no one had any idea who they had just humiliated. But that was only the beginning. Because someone they buried 10 years ago just walked through the door. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. There were 5 criminal hearings scheduled that morning in Riverdale County Courthouse. The last one seemed the least important, case 3491, trespassing. A frail old man who looked like he'd been living under a bridge. His shoes didn't match. His beard had more history than hygiene. And when he stepped into the dock, even the public defender sighed. Judge Jonathan Miller didn't bother to lift his eyes. "Name," he muttered. "Walter Hayes." "Spell that." "W-A-L. Got it." He snapped the folder shut. "Mr. Hayes, you're charged with unlawful entry on private property in the township of Blackwood. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Walter blinked like he hadn't heard him. "I was just walking," he mumbled. "That land used to be mine." A few folks in the back chuckled. The judge tapped his gavel. Silence. Then turned to Walter again. "That land belongs to Whitmore Holdings. You're not in Kansas anymore, old man. This is corporate America." But Walter didn't argue. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flip phone. A dinosaur of a device. The judge rolled his eyes. "If you're calling your imaginary lawyer, make it fast." Walter pressed a number. It rang once. "Victoria. It's me." That was all he said. Less than 5 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened. She entered like a storm, heels echoing across the floor, briefcase in one hand, a 1,000-yard stare in the other. Dark suit. Red lipstick. Her presence drained the oxygen from the room. "Victoria Hayes," she announced. "CEO of Hayes Capital Partners." The judge blinked. She looked at Walter with a nod. "Dad." And just like that, everything changed. Whispers rustled like wine through corn stalks. The bailiff nearly dropped his clipboard. The public defender, who'd been halfway through a crossword puzzle, sat up straight. Victoria placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. "Before you proceed, Your Honor, I suggest you read these documents. Deeds. Purchase orders. Proof that the land Mr. Hayes was found on, Lot 7 in Blackwood, is in final acquisition stage by our company. My father isn't just allowed to walk there. He still owns part of it under dormant title." The judge stammered, that can't be right." The title was cleared. "No," Victoria said coldly, "it was never contested. Because no one expected the owner to come home." The silence was thunderous. But she wasn't done. "In addition," she said, flipping a second file open, "our charitable legal foundation, created in my father's name, provides funding for judicial stipends in this very district. Including, might I add, yours." Judge Miller turned pale. Victoria stepped forward. "I'll give you one chance to do the right thing. Drop the charges. Apologize. Or I'll have this courtroom crawling with federal auditors by lunch." It took 15 seconds for the gavel to fall. "All charges dropped," Judge Miller muttered. "Case dismissed." But that wasn't the end. Not even close. As Walter turned to leave, he paused. Looked over his shoulder. And with a quiet strength in his voice, he said, "I built this town. Brick by brick. Deal by deal. I didn't trespass on your land. You trespassed on my memory. Victoria walked beside him out of the courtroom. But even as they stepped into the sunlight, neither of them smiled. Not yet. Because Walter had a secret. A much darker one. The land he'd walked that morning wasn't just childhood nostalgia. It was a grave. A place where someone he loved had been buried. Or so he thought. Until the night before the trial, when he saw her. Standing in the shadows. Alive. The morning after the trial, the papers were still hot off the press. The man who owned the court, they called it. But Walter Hayes didn't care. He wasn't reading headlines. He was looking at a photograph. One he hadn't seen in over 40 years. It showed 3 children, barefoot in a field of sunflowers, behind the Blackwood train depot. Walter stood in the middle, grinning wide. On his left, his kid brother, Jimmy, who vanished in '67 and was never found. On his right, a girl named Eleanor Wright. Everyone thought she died in a fire in '74. Everyone but Walter. Because last night, he'd seen her. She was older now. Wore a red scarf the same way she did back then, looped loose around the neck. He saw her just past the edge of the woods behind the Blackwood Baptist Church. For a second, their eyes met. Then she turned and disappeared like smoke. Victoria thought it was grief talking. Or age. But Walter had always trusted one thing more than any boardroom instinct, his gut. And it was telling him that something was wrong in Blackwood. Real wrong. They drove out that afternoon. The sun was low and gold, the way it used to be when Walter rode his rusted Schwinn down the dirt path to McClellan's general store. Only now, everything had fences. Gates. Security cameras. Hayes Capital had bought half the town for revitalization, but Walter hadn't known that the buyouts were being pushed this hard. "Dad," Victoria said, flipping through her tablet. "These properties are in foreclosure, most of them. We're not kicking people out." "Then why are they scared?" "Scared?" He pointed. Across the street, a woman was pulling her children back into the house like she'd seen a ghost. Walter knocked on her door anyway. She didn't answer. But a small note slid out under the door. "He's back. Don't trust Harold." Walter's breath caught. Harold Barnes. His oldest friend. His best man at the wedding. Now a smiling city councilman in charge of heritage redevelopment. Back in the courthouse, Judge Miller sat hunched at his desk, whiskey in his drawer and sweat in his collar. The phone rang. "Speak," he croaked. A voice on the line said, "You let the old man off too easy." "I didn't have a choice. It was legal." "You had a choice," the voice hissed. "Now you'll fix it. Or you'll be next." Then silence. Judge Miller sat there staring into nothing. For the first time in 20 years on the bench, he felt afraid. That night, Walter found the place where the fire happened. The old Wright house. Burned to its bones. Still smelled like charcoal and rust. He stood in the yard for a long time. And then he saw it. Tucked behind a broken fence post, fresh flowers. Bright white lilies. He bent to pick one up, and underneath was a ribbon. Red. Tied in a knot. The same knot Eleanor used to wear around her ponytail. The same knot in the scarf of the woman he saw by the church. "She's alive," he whispered. But someone was watching. From the tree line, a camera clicked. And half a mile away, in a white-paneled house that reeked of cigars and secrets, Councilman Harold Barnes sipped his scotch. "Let him dig," he said to the figure beside him. "The more he remembers, the easier it'll be to bury him again." 2 days later. Victoria met with Harold at the Blackwood Rotary Hall, under the pretense of reviewing zoning plans. But Harold had other plans. You ever wonder why your dad walked away from the company in the first place? He asked her. I assumed he retired. Burnout. No, Harold leaned in. He was protecting something. Victoria narrowed her eyes. What? Harold just smiled. Ask him about the black ledger. Then watch what happens. That night, Walter sat alone in his room, flipping through an old lockbox he'd kept under his bed. Inside were documents, photographs, and one worn journal. He opened it. The name inside made his hands shake. James Hayes, 1966. His brother. The last entry read. Harold says I'm not safe. I saw what they did behind the depot. If I disappear, it's him. Walter dropped the journal. His best friend had lied to him. For over 50 years. But what haunted him more was the second part of that note from the woman in the house. Don't trust Harold. Walter turned to the final page. Taped there was a photograph. 3 boys in church choir robes. One of them was Harold. The second. Walter. And the third? The boy he thought was long dead. James. Staring straight into the camera. With eyes full of terror. Blackwood had its stories. But none were written down. They lived in whispers, in shut windows, in the quiet silence of the church basement. Until Walter Hayes found the black ledger. He dug it up from the crawlspace of the old train depot. Same floorboards he and his brother used to hide under when they played bandits. Only now, the dust stung deeper, like it remembered what happened there. Wrapped in oilcloth, the ledger was thick. Smelled like mold and secrets. Handwritten. Names. Dates. Transactions. Bribes. A map of the town's corruption, charted in black ink across decades. At the top of the first page, property control, 1965 to 1973. And the signature at the bottom? H.B. Harold Barnes. Walter staggered back from the page. His knees buckled. It wasn't just shady deals. There were initials beside some of the names. J.H., James Hayes. He flipped to the middle. Entries got darker. May 12, 70, R.D. transferred to safe house. Witness protection. June 2, 70, J.H. intercepted. Package returned to sender. August 19, 70, girl seen at fire site. Relocated. He stopped breathing. The girl. Eleanor. The fire had been no accident. And his brother had been alive long after the town said he was gone. Walter stumbled out into the rain, gripping the ledger like a crucifix. He needed answers. But first, he needed someone who still remembered. That night, he found her. Eleanor. She was living under the name Nora Whitman, a caretaker for the church archives. The same church where they'd lit candles as kids. The same church where Harold Barnes still held monthly fundraisers. She opened the door with fear in her eyes, until she saw his face. Walter, she whispered. She hadn't spoken his name in 50 years. He stepped forward, soaked to the bone. Held out the ledger. I need to know what happened to James. She didn't speak. Just opened her arms and let the man she once loved fall into them like a broken tree. Inside, she told him everything. That night in 67, James had followed Harold. Saw him and a few others in a secret meeting, burning land deeds, handing off envelopes to men from out of town. Men with no names. James had snapped pictures with a toy camera. He told Eleanor he was going to blow the whole thing open. She begged him not to. The next day, he vanished. Everyone thought he drowned in the river. They found his bike by the bridge. But no body. Eleanor swore she saw him a week later, shoved into a car by 2 men in sheriff's uniforms. She tried to tell people. Nobody listened. Except one man. Harold Barnes. He told her to keep quiet, for her safety. And when she didn't, her family's house caught fire. That was the night she died. Only she didn't. The church took her in. Gave her a new name. Moved her to another town. Years passed. She came back only after Harold announced the Blackwood revitalization plan. "He's not done, Walter," she whispered. "He's digging up the past. Not to rebuild it, but to bury what's left." Walter stood. "Then we dig faster." Meanwhile, Victoria was meeting with a reporter from the Ledger Times, a firebrand named Roland Trask. She handed him a photocopy of the journal and the first few pages of the Ledger. Roland's eyes widened. This is bigger than land fraud. This is conspiracy. State level." Victoria nodded. "I want it published." Roland hesitated. "You realize what this does to your father's legacy? This happened under his nose." Victoria didn't blink. "He built an empire. But he never sold his soul. Harold did. I'll burn the whole company down before I let it shield a man like that." Roland smiled. "Then let's start the fire." But Harold Barnes was watching. That night, a break-in was reported at Ledger Times' office. All computers wiped. Files gone. Roland Trask hospitalized after a hit-and-run. Victoria got the news just after midnight. She tried calling her father. No answer. Because Walter was already gone. He'd gone back to the place where it all began. The old mine shaft on the outskirts of town. Where the Ledger said witnesses were stored. He climbed down alone. No flashlight. Just an old lighter and a heart full of vengeance. Down there, beneath 40 years of silence, he found a room. Concrete. Chained lockers. And on the far wall, painted in fading red letters. "Trust no one." Inside one locker was a box. Inside the box, was a photograph. James Hayes. Older. In military fatigues. Standing beside another man. Walter dropped it. Because the other man was Harold Barnes. The sky cracked open the day the town buried Roland Trask. They said it was a hit-and-run. A tragedy. An accident. But Walter Hayes had read too many stories in his time, real ones, not printed ones, to believe in that kind of coincidence. And deep in his gut, that same gut that once built an empire and later buried it in silence, he knew what was coming. He just didn't know who was coming back. The box in the mine shaft had more than a photograph. There was also a dog tag. It had rusted at the edges, but the name was clear. James Hayes. He wasn't just alive longer than they claimed, he'd been in uniform. And not the U.S. Army either. No branch. No insignia. Just numbers and a blank service record. Black Ops. Ghost units. People who didn't officially exist. Walter stared into the darkness and felt something ancient stir inside his chest. Guilt. Rage. Hope. All tied together in a knot that hadn't come undone in decades. He climbed out of the shaft that night with one thing burning in his heart. James never ran. James was taken. Victoria was waiting in the car. When she saw the dog tag, she blinked twice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." "Nobody did," Walter said. "That's how they wanted it." "Who's they?" Walter just looked out the window. "Harold, for starters. And whoever he's still working for." Victoria exhaled. "Dad, we need protection. These people, whoever they are, aren't playing around." Walter shook his head. "We're past protection. It's time to let this ghost walk." The next day, Victoria held a press conference outside Hayes' Capital headquarters. She held up the ledger, the dog tag, and a copy of her uncle's hidden service file. The documents proved that James Hayes had been listed as reassigned under a civilian code managed through the state attorney's office. The same office Harold Barnes had chaired in 1971. The silence from the press pool was ice cold. Until one voice rang out. "Where is James Hayes now?" Victoria's jaw clenched. "We don't know." But Walter did. At least, he thought he did. That night, Walter returned to the old ranger cabin in the pines outside Blackwood. It was a place he hadn't been in 50 years. A place his father had built. A place only one other person had ever known about. James. The door was open. Inside, the fire was already burning. And sitting in the chair by the hearth, wrapped in a threadbare army coat, was a man whose eyes had once stared up at Walter from a choir photograph in a different lifetime. "Hey, Walt," the man said. Walter didn't speak. Couldn't. He dropped to his knees. "You're alive," he croaked. "After all this time." James stood. He limped slightly. His face was older, scarred, a roadmap of pain and survival. "I never left," he said. And then he pulled Walter into a hug that smelled like smoke and pine and half a century of ghosts. Later that night, over black coffee and barely contained tears, James told the story. After he was taken, he was turned into a contractor, an informant, a cleaner. All because he saw too much as a boy, and they knew he'd talk. "They broke me," James whispered. "But I remembered. I remembered Eleanor. I remembered the fire. And I remembered you." Walter leaned forward. "Why now? Why come back now?" James looked him in the eye. "Because Harold's getting ready to finish what he started. The whole revitalization thing, it's not about the town. It's about what's under the town." "What do you mean?" "There's a vault, Walter. Under Blackwood Bank. It doesn't hold money. It holds evidence. Ledgers. Film. Names. And Harold? He's burning the last of it tomorrow night." Meanwhile, back in Blackwood, Harold Barnes was on the phone. Yes. He saw the ledger. And yes, he's back. A pause. "I don't care. If James shows his face, we bury him again." He hung up. Turned to a man in the shadows behind him. "You know what to do." The man nodded. And stepped into the light. Victoria gasped. It was Martin Holloway. Her godfather. The man who taught her to drive. The man who used to bounce her on his knee. "I told you to trust no one," he said. "Even me." That night, the courthouse exploded. Files. Archives. Gone. Just like that. Victoria screamed when she got the call. Walter and James were already on the move. They'd seen it coming. They knew Harold was making his final play. The only question now, was whether they could make theirs in time. Because if that vault was real, and if the ledger was only half the truth, then everything that followed would shake the town of Blackwood to its knees. There's a silence that comes before war. Not the kind with guns and uniforms. The kind that tears through old towns and older men. The kind that begins not with a bang, but with a whisper behind a locked door. Blackwood's final whisper began at 4:12 a.m., beneath the old bank vault that nobody remembered, but Walter Hayes never forgot. James led the way through the service tunnel. His limp was worse now. The cold bit through his coat, but he pressed on like a man carrying not just the burden of proof, but the weight of his own grave. "This was where they took me," he said. "Down here. In '68. Said it was a safe place. Told me I'd help protect the town." Walter gritted his teeth. "You were a boy." James gave a bitter smile. "They like boys. They don't argue as much. The tunnel opened into a chamber of concrete and dust. In the far wall, buried behind false drywall and a rusted fuse panel, was the vault. Steel. 6-inch thick. The combination long forgotten. But Walter hadn't built half the town without picking up a few skills. He ran his hand along the seam. Felt the old pressure switch. And smiled. "She's still wired," he muttered. 5 minutes later, the vault door groaned open like the gates of hell. Inside, they found it. Boxes. Labeled. Dated. Photographs. Audio reels. Handwritten ledgers. And in the center, a metal crate, marked Operation Cradle, Federal Eyes Only. Walter opened it. Inside was a film reel. The label made his blood freeze. James Hayes, interrogation. Age 10. Walter turned away, eyes stinging. James didn't. He just whispered, "I remember it." And pressed play. Meanwhile, above ground, Victoria stood in the Riverdale courthouse, staring down Harold Barnes. "You had a chance," she said coldly. "You could have retired, walked away. But you had to keep digging." Harold didn't blink. "I built this town before you were even born. I made men. Gave out power like bread at a soup line. And your father? He was nothing. Just a scared boy who got lucky." Victoria stepped forward. "He was 10 years old. You tortured a child. And I kept the streets clean." "No, Harold," she whispered. "You just made the dirt look like marble." James and Walter arrived at the courthouse just before noon. The town square was already crawling with reporters. Cops. Half the city council. Victoria stood at the top of the courthouse steps. She raised the film reel above her head. "This is the truth," she said, her voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. "This is what was buried. This is what was stolen." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Why now?" And James, old, bent, but unbroken, stepped forward and said, "Because you buried me alive. But I never stopped breathing." The courtroom filled to capacity within the hour. The judge assigned was new. Honest. Young. Scared. The evidence laid bare. The ledger. The recordings. The documents tracing funds from Blackwood's redevelopment to shell companies tied to Barnes. And the final blow? A confession. Handwritten. By Martin Holloway. He'd been dying for months. Cancer. No one knew. He left it for Victoria. It detailed how he and Barnes had orchestrated the fire, faked Eleanor's death, paid off the sheriff, and framed James as unfit. He ended it with 6 words. "Tell Walter I was always sorry." When the judge called for Barnes to speak, the old man just stood. He didn't beg. He didn't confess. He smiled. "I am Blackwood," he said. "Without me, this town rots." And as the gavel came down, he leaned in toward Victoria. "They'll forget. You'll see." Victoria didn't flinch. "No," she said. "This time, we remember." 3 months later. Blackwood was rebuilding. This time the right way. Walter stood on the hill overlooking the old depot. The new memorial gleamed under the sun. A bronze plaque bore the names of every life buried under corruption. James stood beside him, arms crossed. "You sure you want to stay?" Walter asked. "I do," James said. "It's time to live in the open. For once." Walter chuckled. "Takes guts." "Yeah. Or a hell of a sister-in-law." Victoria stepped up behind them, smiling. "The town's yours again, boys." They nodded. And for the first time in decades, it truly was. 1 week later, Walter got a letter. No return address. Just a slip of paper inside. It read. I wasn't the only one. Underneath was a photograph. Black and white. Of James Hayes. And 3 other children. All marked, Project Cradle, Phase 2. And in the background was a man in a trench coat. Face turned just enough to reveal his identity. Not Barnes. Not Holloway. Someone they thought was dead. Someone whose grave Walter had visited 20 years ago. His brother, Jacob Hayes. The oldest Hayes brother. Buried in 1953. But standing in that photo, in 1971. Alive. Watching. Waiting. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.